This time, we're delighted to be joined from the United Nations in Geneva by our special guests, Richard Kozul Wright and Mahmoud Elkhafif. Thank you both very much for joining us. A little bit about our guest today. Richard is Director of Globalisation and Development Strategies in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, otherwise known as UNCTAD. He's worked at the United Nations in both New York and Geneva. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge in the UK and has published widely on economic issues. Mahmoud is the coordinator of the Assistance to the Palestinian People's Unit, the APPU, the division on Globalisation and Development Strategies. So you will see that both Richard and Mahmoud work quite closely together. And before joining the United Nations, he was a senior country economist with the African Development Bank and held positions with the federal government of Canada, the Central Bank of Kuwait, and the Institute of National Planning in Egypt. I'm Mark Seddon. I've been a UN correspondent for Al Jazeera in the past, and I've worked for the UN Secretary General, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and last year for the President of the UN General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa. Now, before we begin, there is going to be a real focus today on Palestine and the United Nations, Palestine and the economy, Palestine and the upcoming US elections in November. All topical issues. We're very, very keen to hear from you. And I know that a number of you have already joined from the States, from India, from the UK, from Italy. So thank you. We will be taking your questions and putting them to Mahmoud and Richard. And once again, thank you both, Richard and Mahmoud, for joining us today. And really, I'd just like to begin by asking you, Mahmoud, if I can begin with you. I mean, it seems a fairly obvious thing to say, but the global economy is hanging on a precipice. There's a pandemic stalking the globe. It's striking the most vulnerable and seems to be assisted in that process by some of the most incompetent. This is a value judgment on some of the global leadership, but I'd like to begin by asking you, at this time, especially when the domestic media of various member states is focused just on the COVID-19 epidemic and what it means to that particular country, how do you raise the voice and the pleas and the demands and the needs of the Palestinians at a time of COVID-19?
Well, this is the major problem now. I mean, the attention of the COVID-19 in all developing countries and developed countries is taken away from a serious problem, and it seems that this problem will not go away with the COVID. On the contrary, I think after that, what's going on with the COVID-19 subside, then we are going to face a real problem with the Palestinian people and all over the Middle East. So I think it's a major issue, and I think the media has to play put more focus on what's happening on now in Palestine. So it is an issue, and it's taken away the attention for an issue deserve more attention, especially about what we hear now about annexation and more annexation. And well, I think Israel is taking a bit of advantage of the situation.
I'll come. We're going to be talking about the issue of annexation later, but actually just on that and your focus on international media and raising the profile of the Palestinians. I mean, at the moment, the United Nations has gone virtual. The Security Council seems to be in intractable terms, struggling to get agreement on virtually anything, and yet at this time. Major that we have a Trump plan, this deal of the century. We have a possibility of annexation, and when Palestinians look to international institutions, they see them barely functioning. So, what is the hope and desire from people in Palestine now from the United Nations?
I think, there are two issues. Two parallel things here. The UN country team, that's the people in the field, and then people like us here in Geneva or in New York. I think the need for the support of the colleagues in the field is very important. WHO, FAO, the UN country team, UNSCO, the peace process. I mean, especially now, maybe we'll talk about that in a bit later, about what's going on in terms of finance and transferring Palestinian money from Israel. So the function and the needs for the people in the field, it's extremely high now. That's one thing. The other thing is, yes, everything is going virtual, but we are working here on our report to the General Assembly. We are working here about report to the United Nations Trade and Development Board. And we have already, I mean, there are 2 reports in the pipeline, and these reports focus on what's going on the ground, and focus on the responsibility of the international community and responsibility of Israel as an occupying power towards the Palestinian people. So it is, I mean, it is important that we keep going.
Well, before I turn to Richard, one last question on that. The General Assembly, at the moment, it looks as though it might be meeting online. I mean, the idea that the General Assembly is going to gather in New York in September, it's up in the air. I mean, there's going to be a Turkish presidency, as you know. There's talk possibly of postponing the General Assembly. But at this time, if there's deadlock in the Security Council, and even if the General Assembly is held over or delayed or happens online, is there not more that can be done at General Assembly level? Isn't it time now for a bit more leverage from the Palestinians with all of their allies in the global south to push the General Assembly? You mentioned these reports, to push the General Assembly to be much more proactive. Mahmoud, that's for you. I'm going to. Sorry, I know.
So I thought it is as a matter of fact. I mean, the General Assembly gave us a new mandate about 3-4 years ago, and General Assembly is very supportive. I mean, recently they have asked us to assess and then report to the General Assembly on the economic cost of the Israeli occupation. This is a very important exercise. It's an exercise with less, because the idea of keeping the cost on record, it's extremely important. Because I mean, if you look at the report that have been submitted to UN bodies, nothing is systematic about the impact or what have the Israeli done toward the economy. Nothing is systematically recorded and assessed and reported. So we are dealing with a very difficult issue, an issue that has been there since 1948, and then you have the COVID-19. Before that, you have the new liberalism and the impact on developing countries. So I mean, with such an issue, competing with other issues such as neoliberalism, such as debt, and so the developing countries, Group of 77, are really, I mean, find it a bit more difficult to focus on a very important issue that will not go away, the Palestinian issues. So given circumstances, I think we are getting a mandate. We are trying to fulfill it, but it's competing with other important issues as well.
Well, Richard, I mean, we've touched on Mahmoud's mentioned. We touched on the obviously the COVID-19 pandemic and how this has impacted the international institutions. But also, I suppose my question to you is, and I don't know if you can answer it really, but do you think, to a degree, this whole pandemic is being used as an opportunity to bury difficult issues by the global community? And just hope that they're not going to get noticed, and particularly, I suppose, the annexation.
Well, I don't think, to be honest, I don't think Netanyahu needed COVID-19 to be pursuing his annexation agenda. That's clear. He was going ahead with that, but certainly, I mean, clearly, it takes attention away from what should be up front and center on the agenda of the international community. I mean, annexation is the way it's happening is a clear affront to international law, to endless UN resolutions, but it's not as Mahmoud said, it's just simply not didn't get the attention even when last year Palestine was in charge of the G77. I mean, which it was last year, and we still didn't get the kind of attention that you would expect. So I mean, it's complicating everything. But I mean, if you take the impact of what is going on now in the United States on this question, I mean, it's not clear to me that Netanyahu actually would have liked the COVID-19 to be taking place, because it's triggered all these emotions around Black Lives Matter, around the militarization and brutalization of police activity, all of which have a parallel in the Palestinian context. You know, you can't address the kind of this uprising of concern all of a sudden about the problem, the endemic problem worldwide of racism. I mean, the Palestinian issue is very much part of that narrative. So, in a way, it may be the case that the consequences of COVID, particularly in the political context of the United States, can bring the Palestinian issue actually more to the center stage of discussions, particularly in an election year there, where you know, everything is seen through the lens of an election. So it's at the moment it's having this, I think, this chilling effect on the Palestinian issue. Whether that will remain the case, I'm not so sure, really.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Richard, because I mean, you will have seen this. There have been some quite strong declarations of Palestinian solidarity to the leaders and those involved in the BLM movement, and so that parallel is kind of being played out on the real in real time. But I just wonder if I could just step back a minute from those issues and actually to focus on, especially for some of the people who are watching this from around the world and who may not know a great deal about UNCTAD as an organization and how it is that actually both of you, but this question is directed to Richard to begin with, both of you and your organization is able to champion the Global South in a way that perhaps other UN agencies aren't. I mean, you do have a degree of freedom that perhaps other agencies don't have. So can you just give us, Richard, some idea of the kind of setup there, you know, and why UNCTAD has got this historic relationship with Palestine in particular?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's in 35 seconds, I guess, Mark, a history of a 60-year-old institution or something like that. Look, we were set up in 1964. We've often been referred to as a trade union for the developing world. You know, the institution was set up it's probably the only institution really set up in the multilateral system by and for developing countries, even though we have universal membership like all other UN bodies, a universal body. But it was set up with the understanding that the international rules of the game that were forged immediately at the end of the Second World War were done by and for and in the interest of the advanced economies. And that as a consequence of that, as more and more developing countries became independent in the 1950s, they had to address all the biases and asymmetries and gaps in that system that made the objective of economic progress, having achieved political progress, but of economic progress, all the more difficult. So you know, we were set up with that. In a way, we were set up with that activist agenda fully in mind of when we began to operate in '64. And in a way, that's given the Secretariat a certain amount of independence to be able to pursue development issues independently of the specific challenges that countries face. Because all different developing countries face all kinds of very specific problems. So they're all united by the fact that they face obstacles at the international level that can only be addressed collectively. So, and the Secretariat's job in that context has always been to highlight the kind of biases and asymmetries, and including those that emerge out of power asymmetries. I mean, ultimately, development challenges reduce to imbalances of power in the system. And if and I think in that context, but Mahmoud can speak more directly to the origins of it in UNCTAD. I mean, it's pretty apparent that the plight of the Palestinian people reflects these huge political and economic asymmetries that other developing countries face in different ways, but nonetheless have to face up to. The specifics of the Palestinian situation have its own dynamic and particular policies, but it's part of a world that is rigged in the favor of those with the economic and political resources. So I mean, and so it's that's the job of UNCTAD, to try and address and to think about solutions to developing country problems, not at the country level, not in terms of what other agencies do in terms of technical assistance at the country level, but in trying to rethink the multilateral rules of the game in ways that correct for those economic and political imbalances in resources and power.
Thanks, Richard. And Mahmoud, I mean, a lot of people will have heard about the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, for instance. It's one of the first UN agencies, long history working with the Palestinians. We now know rather more about UNCTAD, but tell us, if you will, how it is that, for instance, your APPU came to be. I mean, your how does the Special Assistance Unit for the Palestinian people operate? I mean, you mentioned that the work that you do for the General Assembly, but how do you prevent any kind of overlap? And I suppose, what is the main kernel of your work for Palestine?
I guess the only exception in UNCTAD for the country level is Palestine. Palestine is the only country or the only people that has a unit within UNCTAD. And it was established in the mid-80s as a matter, and the first mandate that we got is to assess the impact of the Israeli policies on the Palestinian economy. That was the very first mandate that was given to us. With the establishment of the Palestinian National Authorities in 1994, actually we start to move a bit toward capacity building, especially in what we call the hope years, the period after 1994 till 2000, till the eruption of the second Intifada on 28th September the year 2000. During that period, we helped the Palestinian Authority to establish something like its custom authority in the area of demand debt management, in the area of trade facilitation. But recently, with the slowdown in the peace process, and now the period that we are living through now, we start to go back again toward the area of assessment, the impact of the Israeli policy on the Palestinian economy. What's very important, since actually 6 years ago, we got a new mandate from the Assembly, as I said before, asking UNCTAD to assess, evaluate, and then report to the GA on the economic cost of the Israeli occupation. As I said before, that was not done before. How much did the occupation cost the Palestinian people in terms? If we say that since the occupation in 1967, there were more than 11 million productive trees has been uprooted. The record of what the economic impact, what's the cost year after year to the Palestinian people, that has not been done before. I think in the last 2 or 3 years, we become more focused on these issues. We have an issue with resources to do this mandate, but we are trying to do it and trying to keep it on record. This record has to be there, if not this year, next year. The overlap, nobody within the UN system does work on the economy of Palestine in the area of development, the area of trade, the area of investment. Nobody is doing that. So we are with it. There is the World Bank, there is the IMF, but that's another story. I mean, again, the World Bank, IMF, they deal with Palestine as if it's a normal developing country, and they give Palestine the normal prescription, which basically fiscal austerity and so on. So in terms of overlapping, there is no overlapping. There is the UN country that will give them support. We give advisory service to Palestinian NGOs like MAS, the Institute for Assessment of Economic Policy Analysis. We give support to the UN country team in terms of the impact of economic issues. So in terms of overlapping, there is no overlapping. In terms of focus, I think we are more focused now on the economic cost of the Israeli occupation to put things on record for the future.
Richard, if I can quickly turn to you, almost wherever you look, I mean, and looking at some of the work that Mahmoud has been doing about the Palestinian economy, you can see that so much of the progress, the period of that you were just talking about after 1994 of hope, when there was economic expansion. I mean, everything has been thrown off course by COVID-19. Of course, there are other issues too, but I mean, even to the level of the 140,000 Palestinians who usually go to work in Israel every day, obviously have been prevented from doing so. That's just one level of the economic collapse in the Palestine economy. Now, this collapse in the Palestine economy is kind of mirrored, you would imagine, elsewhere. So on the broader level, you've been doing a great deal of work around the idea of a green new economy, and reordering the global economy. And you would think that after this particular pandemic, the demand for substantive change is going to be very, very, very powerful. So your argument might get strengthened, but practically for a small territory like Palestine, whose economy has suffered a great deal, what immediately can be done post-pandemic?
Well, I mean, as Mahmoud said, there are these generic challenges that Palestine faces that we can make a positive contribution to, but the politics of the Palestinian challenge constantly impose on that situation and gives it a unique quality, which it makes it very difficult to extend policy advice. I mean, the kind of generic policies that the World Bank and the IMF offer, just don't make sense if you take it out of the political context that defines the possibilities of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian people. So I mean that side of it is just a constant challenge. Again, it goes, I think, in terms of the work we do on more generally on the need to find more inclusive and sustainable and resilient futures for developing countries around ideas of a global Green New Deal, ultimately rests on, this is not just a kind of technical or simplistic kind of policy model. It's a recognition of the need to change a set of rules of the game that have been rigged over the last 40 years in favor of powerful countries and powerful corporations, the two often being mutually supportive of each other. So again, and it goes back to the question you asked before about the distinct nature of UNCTAD. It's the willingness, I think, to bring in the power dimension, the political economy dimension into the challenges that we face that distinguishes UNCTAD from other UN institutions. And that's just as much true of the work on the Palestinian economy as it is on other areas of work that we do. And I think, I think that does give us an ability to say things that about both the specific challenges of countries and the wider global challenges that makes our work different. And there are some interesting parallels. But one of the big issues, as Mahmoud has written about in the work that we do, and one of the big challenges that faces the Palestinian economy is the problem of water and access to water. It's an endless problem, and the way in which Israel again rigs the rules of the game that essentially make it very difficult for Palestine, both in agriculture and in industry, use that basic resource, which strictly speaking should be under their control. I mean, it's part of the Palestinian territory, but because the rules of the game are rigged against them, makes it very difficult to forge a consistent economic path forward. That's true. I mean, that's going to be a massive issue as the climate changes and we get all the problems emerging around rising global temperatures. Water is going to be a huge issue. In that sense, Palestine has a lot of worrying implications for the future challenges of many developing countries, as resources are controlled more and more tightly by those who have already gained advantages from this hyper-globalized neoliberal world. So, I mean, I think bringing this kind of issue of the interplay between economic challenges and political asymmetries, power asymmetries, is something that is central to our work in general, but I think very relevant to the Palestinian challenges in particular.
You see, I mean, listening to Richard there, Mahmoud, when you consider a typical member state of the UN developing economy, it doesn't really cross over to the Palestinian experience, if you like. The West Bank, a cantonized territory, Gaza, which has been, I think there have been 3 consecutive military campaigns by Israel in Gaza, where the whole infrastructure is kind of almost destroyed in order to be rebuilt. So you keep having to have this kind of year zero rebuild of Gaza. Let it not be forgotten, one of the most densely populated places on the planet. And then, of course, you get this crisis with the pandemic on top of it all. I mean, it must be very, very difficult to try and get some sort of coordinated economic policy for the Palestinian territories.
This is true. I mean, coordination between the West Bank and Gaza is very difficult. I mean, add to this what's happening. I mean, but what we're trying to do actually in one of the most recent studies is if you look at, there were 3 wars, and Gaza is under blockade since June 2007. There are bits and pieces here about how much the destruction, 2 billion here, 4 billion there, but nothing so far. How much? What if there were no blockade and no wars? How much would the Palestinians in Gaza been able to produce with their own? I mean, Gaza now has no production base whatsoever. I mean, if you look at the manufacturing and agriculture sector in Gaza, it has been, almost shrunk by half. I mean, it used to be in 1995, this productive sector in Gaza was 34% of the economy. Now it's about 20%. But if you look at Gaza's economy contributions to Palestinian economy between 2006 and 2018, it went down from 31% of the Palestinian economy to 18% of the Palestinian economy. What we are trying to do is to quantify, to put some figures. How much do the Palestinians lose in terms of? We are not talking about death here. We are not talking about. Nobody could put a dollar sign on a loss of life or a loss of the ability for a household to earn. But the economy, the Palestinian people in Gaza, how much did they lose? How much do they lose every year? And who's responsible for this? It's the occupation. I mean, Gaza is under blockade for now almost 13 years. There were 3 wars.
Well, but if I may interrupt you there, I mean, there's a question that kind of follows on from that, and I'll ask Richard about this too, but from Fahid Abu Akal, Fahid asks, do you know why the 22 Arab states, including the 52 Muslim states, are not able to use their political power? Suppose they returned their ambassadors to the United States from Washington until Congress changes its policy towards Palestine. Would that help end the 52 years of occupation? Would it make a difference? I think so. That's the question about kind of a wider solidarity. Like, where is it, and how can it be engendered? I'll ask you that first, if that's all right, Mahmoud, and I'll ask Richard.
Well, I mean, you have to put this in not only political context but also historical context. I mean, look at the Middle East now. Look at the Arab world now. I mean, you have a problem in Syria, you have a problem in Libya, you have a problem in Yemen, you have a problem in Sudan, and so the focus is becoming very thin on Palestine. But if you look at it again, I think, in my opinion, the core issue is Palestine. The core issue is what happened since, not only since 1948, but even since Balfour Declaration. So it is a dynamic issue. I mean, we have the Palestinian people here, we have Gaza again, and so it is very difficult to answer this question. But this issue continue to be, I mean, you cannot just brush it under the rug. I mean, it will not go away. But our job, again, I just want to continue with, is to keep these things on record, because this issue won't go away. Occupation is there, blockade is there. There are 2 million people are, as has been said, in the giant open air prison.
Yes.
And somebody has to pay for that.
Yes. A prison where, incidentally, the prisoners have to feed themselves. There's a question here. This is a question.
The problem, excuse me, they have to feed themselves. If you have the means to feed themselves, that's
yes. Well, that makes it even worse. Richard, this is for you. Sam Bahua, he says, we haven't prompted Sam to send in this question, by the way, but he says, welcome all. I am a regular consumer of UNCTAD's excellent work. My question is, has UNCTAD engaged Egypt in terms of opening the Gaza-Egypt border and bringing more, helping with trade facilitation?
I think Mahmoud's better placed to answer that. But I mean, look, there's a bigger question behind your question mark about the whole notion of the solidarity in the South. I mean, obviously, UNCTAD and our strength in our first 20 or 30 years was based on a fairly high level of solidarity amongst G77 countries, and that culminated in an effort, and in very serious efforts, to establish a new international economic order in the 1970s through the General Assembly and the UN processes. And that failed ultimately. It failed for all kinds of reasons, but primarily it failed because developing countries themselves in the 1980s went into very serious crises that were in many respects instigated by the advanced economies, particularly the United States. And, the South has been a much more fragmented animal for the last 20 or 30 years than it was in its first 20 or 30 years, at least within UNCTAD. And that's difficult now, and that's true of the Arab world too. I mean, the Arab world is not a solid political force, and this again goes back to the Kissinger was manipulating the Arab world from the 1970s on. I mean, this was about oil as much as it was about Palestine back in the 1970s. But there's not. I mean, the notion of a very solidaristic bloc that could somehow act in unison to push for a solution of the Palestinian problem, which we would like to see, has not really been on the cards for the last this 1970s was when that option seemed to be on the table, right, around the use of oil as a political weapon to some extent. That's not the world we're in, I think. It's not the world we're in anymore, Mark.
No.
And so I mean, the only two countries I think that Israel technically has a peace treaty with are Egypt and Jordan, right? Are the only two countries that Israel. But the rest is fragmented along all kinds of different lines, political, religious. So there is not solidarity in the Arab world that can really bring about a solution, I think, at this moment in time. And that's part of the tragedy of the Palestinian people right now.
Yeah. Richard, you mentioned just there Jordan and Egypt. So I'll take that question from Sam Bahur to you, Mahmoud. And that was the question about, has UNCTAD been engaged with Egypt in terms of putting pressure on Egypt to open the border with Gaza? I mean, that has really been a terrible choke point, as you know.
No, this is not an UNCTAD mandate. I mean, I don't think we are involved in the political. We are not involved in the political process. Our mandate in this area is to keep record, is to assess situation and report to member states. But what we can see is also the occupying power has it has to carry its own responsibility. If you look at the crossing between Gaza and the West Bank and Israel itself, there are 5 crossings. Only one of them is operating now, and also it's operating on very exceptional basis, on for medical reasons, but very exceptional basis. So as far as putting UNCTAD to put pressure on a specific country, or Egypt, another country, I don't think UNCTAD is in a position to do this. The other way for the Palestinians to get out to the world is Rafah, and I think between I have the figures here between 2007 and 2018, Rafah crossing was open 2,126 days and closed almost the same number, and most of this time it was between 2014 and 2017, especially with after 2014, that was a major military operation that Israel imposed on Gaza. So it's a political sensitive situation, and we are not in a position to put pressure on any member states, but we are in a position to report to member states for them to take a decision.
I get that. I suppose the question might also be, and this has been raised by a couple of other people as well, which is looking at particularly at Gaza and its situation now with the endless blockade and the terrible suffering there. If and this isn't a question that you can answer, but I mean, technically, would it be possible if the people of Gaza say, well, just for a while, we want to become a UN trust territory? That could break the blockade. Is that something that could be even thought about, or is that just so way out there it's not even worth a second thought?
I don't think that would be a good idea. I mean, the solution is to end the blockade.
Help end it? Would it help end it by becoming a UN trust territory just for a short period, for instance? Would it hasten the end of the blockade?
I don't think so. I don't think so. On the contrary, I think this will relieve the pressure of the occupying power to carry its own responsibility. It may deepen the divide between Gaza and the West Bank. It may establish a new fact on the ground. I don't think that would be a good idea. I think the international community has responsibility toward the Palestinian people, and Israel, as the occupying power, has a responsibility toward the Palestinian people, toward its own citizens as well. The blockade has to end. The occupation has to end, and to end this giant prison, open prison. I mean, I mean, this. I don't think that happened ever in history. I mean, you have 2 million human beings under siege now for more than 13 years. I mean, it's just incredible. I don't know. I mean, and to put it under, this has to end.
And also, I mean, it's a kind of sad state of affairs, I guess, that 100 years after Palestine became under trusteeship in the League of Nations, which is part of the problem. This is part of the origins of the problem, right, Mark? That somehow 100 years later, becoming a trusteeship again might provide a solution to this. What is on any criteria? It's an affront to international law. It's an affront to international decency. That somehow we can't, as an international community, confront what is the real problem, which is the abuse of an occupying power, by addressing that problem, but rather trying to kind of stitch together solutions that failed in the past as a possible way of alleviating this. I mean, there's something pretty tragic about that state of affairs.
It strikes me that we're coming to a crunch point, given the stated plans of the Netanyahu-Gantz administration towards annexation. and also the fact that this Israeli government believes it has a kind of a green light from the US administration. Now, this week, as you know, the EU, the German foreign minister was in Israel. He didn't go to the West Bank, but he met with Netanyahu. He restated the EU's position, because it's the German presidency of the EU right now. He restated the position of the EU on international law, but said absolutely nothing about what consequences there could be as far as the EU is concerned if this annexation goes ahead. I suppose the question is, should it go ahead? And then Palestine decides, actually, we are going to seek a recognition as a sovereign state now. We're going to forget all of this talk about a two-state solution, because the two-state solution's been dead in the water for so long, and this is the final nail in its coffin. Is that perhaps why there's a degree of reluctance from the EU and others to see this annexation go ahead, because they don't want to be faced with that stark choice? And what do you think?
Richard, go ahead.
Richard, yeah. What do you think?
I mean, I guess notionally we still in the UN stick to the two-state solution as being the framing of the challenge. I mean, obviously the reality is very different, but it's equally difficult to think of a one-state solution, which many progressive people have, including in Israel itself, have advocated for a long time. So to some extent, I mean, I'm not sure if framing it in this way is the right way. I mean, we're looking for ways in which the treatment of the Palestinian people, can be somehow alleviated. I mean, that's what we're looking for. I mean, that's the abuse of both the international law and of the prospects of the Palestinian population itself, should be enough, one would hope, to think about ways of addressing the problem. Personally, I mean, this is a personal view. The two thinking of the Palestinians as a people basically suggests to me that if they're going to survive as a people, they need state structures to do that. That history tells you that. So how do we make sure that, for example, the Palestinian people have control over their fiscal regime, which is the basis of any state? Any state must be in control of its fiscal revenues. That is not the case quite clearly now, because Israel has hundreds of ways in which it essentially blocks the revenues that the Palestinian people are entitled to from getting to the Palestinian people. We know that. So, I mean, in a way, the work that we do is an attempt to find solutions to these very specific problems that ultimately, in my opinion, point towards a state structure for the Palestinian people. But trying to focus on these very the issue of water, the issue of fiscal revenues, these trying to kind of come up with real practical solutions on those specific challenges is the kind of way in which we've tried to go in the work that we do. I personally think it ultimately does mean a two-state solution, but in the current politics of the days, you're right, Mark. I mean, since the Oslo Accords, that's just gone down. That's so far gone nowhere. That's clear as well. But ultimately, that's how, keeping pressure on and focusing on those elements of an effective state structure, I think, is the way that we can contribute to finding a way forward in a very difficult political set of circumstances.
And Mahmoud, there's another question here saying, I'm assuming UNCTAD's reports are sent formally to Israel. Has Israel replied to any of them in writing?
No. They have sometimes they do have comments during the discussion of the report, but several times they have sent to our Secretary General here in UNCTAD saying that this report is not objective and so on. But no, they have not replied officially. But I just want to go back to the issue of UNCTAD position. Officially, our position, UNCTAD position, is a two-state solution with Gaza, West Bank, including East Jerusalem as part of the occupied Palestinian territory. What's happening on the ground? Are we heading toward two-state solution? I don't think so. I mean, two-state solution day after day with what being proposed by the U.S. government, and then the unilateral action by Israel is taking away the international community away from two-state solution. Demographic is different. I mean, you have Israel about 6 million population. Maybe 1.5 million of them Palestinians, and then you have the West Bank and Gaza, that's 5 million, and then you have the refugees, and this about 10 millions. I mean, the issue here, the Palestinian cause will never go away. The Palestinian people will never go away. A two-state solution, as Richard said, it is a feasible solution, but it needs the cooperation of the Israeli. I mean, the apparatus of the government, and UNCTAD was part of that. We have helped the Palestinians to establish a custom authority. This is a sovereign authority, but now all of this pillars of a government, of sovereign government, is being basically it's being eroded. So, are we heading toward that? One sacred states? Maybe that's it over the history. I mean, look at the history of South Africa. Ultimately, I mean, but sustainability of such a political and geopolitical condition, it's not sustainable over the long history. The UN position now, two-state is still the two-state solution, but is it feasible? The feasibility of this solution is becoming less and less with the action of the occupying power and its support from the U.S. government. But the United States Secretary General actually made a statement after the peace initiative by the U.S. government last year. So,
well, I mean, we're sort of in our closing moments now. So I wanted really to ask you both. I mean, given that there's going to be a presidential election in the United States in November, and given that currently Democratic nominee Joe Biden appears to be percentages ahead of Trump. If there is a change of administration in the United States in November, does this roll back the annexation plan? Does this make it much more difficult for Netanyahu to do what he wants? Does it put the onus back on the two-state solution again? And I mean, what it's been 2 steps back. Is this 1 step forward? Richard, what do you think?
1 step forward with Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not sure about that, Mark. I don't know the discussions inside the Democratic Party. Obviously, we knew, when Clinton was a candidate against Trump, there was an attempt to bring in Bernie Sanders and some of his positions, which on the Palestinian issue were, I think, much more progressive. But I don't have a great faith that the Democratic Party will move in a significant way to find a solution. It won't be. It will be. It will be less. It won't be the same kind of aggression that you see from the current administration. But I don't know if there is the internal dynamic in the US still yet to come up with solutions. And in a way, just on a personal level, what I find more troubling is the attitude of the wider international community, to be quite frank. I mean, the kind of outrage that we've seen towards China vis-a-vis Hong Kong for a change in some of the rules there that has kind of generated a degree of hostility towards China from the European powers and some of the other advanced economies, is quite. It's quite the contrast with the lack of concern with the Palestinian situation, despite the fact that the breach of international law that we're talking about in the Israeli context pales into significance in comparison with what China is doing with what is notionally part of its own territory, right? I mean, the contrast is quite shocking, actually, and that's not Trump. That you can't blame Trump for that kind of attitude. I think I think the international community, the advanced economies, and the Europeans in particular, despite some of the positions that countries like Sweden have taken, for example, which have been much better, given the affront to international law that is demonstrated on a daily basis here, I think I think we need to get beyond the let's blame Trump for all these problems and start really looking much more systematically at the failure of the advanced economies as a bloc to address this problem in a systematic way and really find lasting solutions. I think that's the real issue.
Taking your point, Richard, I mean, Mahmoud, you will have seen the EU was very strongly critical of Russia when it annexed Crimea. And did institute a sanctions regime of sorts. The German foreign minister in his trip to Israel this week the word sanctions didn't even pass his lips. So that kind of follows from what Richard was saying. But I suppose what I'd like to ask you in the final moments, both of you, but starting with you, Mahmoud, is looking into your crystal ball and looking at the Middle East and Palestine, Israel, 20 years hence. How do you think things can pan out? And given what you just said, crucially, about the demographics and the Palestinians not just going away, how might it look in 20 years' time?
As I said before, the UN official position, two-state solutions, is Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza. Are we heading in that direction? No, we are not heading in that direction. Occupying power impose certain facts on the ground. The international political environment is not forthcoming. Going back to your question about the internal politics in the US, it's not forthcoming. Barack Obama administration, only in the very last few days they have abstained from Security Council Resolution 2334, in which basically stated that the settlement in the West Bank is a flagrant violation of international law. So looking at the history, looking at the present, looking at the political conditions, I think we are getting far away from the two-state solutions. But maybe more than 20 years, I think ultimately people have to learn to live together, and some kind of sanity has to prevail, and either one state or two state, some equal rights has to prevail.
Thank you, Richard.
Well, you want a kind of utopian kind of vision to end on, Mark. If we look, yeah, I mean, there are. You can, if we've reached peak oil and the world is shifting to a different energy system, that will have a big impact. If the dollar as the dominant currency becomes lesser, because when it comes to the ability of the US to impose sanctions on countries, the dollar is the key instrument in that gives the US a lot of power in the world. If there is if there is more countervailing power from Russia and China in 20 years' time, that allows developing countries in general the space to be able to fashion different types of futures. If the young Israelis, many of whom themselves are, I mean, there are movements inside Israel of young Israelis who are also unhappy with the kind of racism that they see around them as a consequence of the actions of the current government. If these things do kind of come into place, then there are clearly the geopolitics of the Middle East changes quite dramatically, and there are genuine options, I think, then for political change. But you know, the current makeup is it's difficult to be optimistic given the current geopolitical situation that the situation is going to improve anytime soon, unfortunately. But there are these changes that we see, and COVID-19 may well accelerate some of those changes, actually. And if the developing world can somehow itself regain the solidarity that in a way put the Palestinian issue into the UNCTAD agenda, if we can regain that sense of a solidarity in the South, then these are all, you know, forces that could make for a more positive agenda, and whether it's a one-state or a two-state solution, bring a degree of kind of inclusivity and democracy and decency ultimately to a situation that lacks all three of those things at the moment.
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you, Mahmoud. I mean, in fact, we did actually see a little glimmer of hope, perhaps this past week in Tel Aviv, where some thousands of Israelis and Palestinians came together to oppose the annexation plans. It's a straw in the wind, but I'd like to thank you both very much for joining us today from Geneva, from all of us here at Palestine Deep Dive, for everybody behind the scenes who made this happen. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Mahmoud. Good luck to you and all that you're doing. And we hope to speak to you again. And until next time, that's all from us. Thank you very much. Oh, very finally, Heather from Italy has said, really excellent conversation. Thank you. So there we are. Thank you both.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks. A pleasure.
Same here. Thanks.